When Patton's army crossed into the Soviet zone first, it changed everything.
May 4, 1945. Chef Headquarters, Reims. Eisenhower receives an intelligence report. Elements of Third Army's 13th Corps have crossed the demarcation line agreed at Yalta and entered territory designated for Soviet occupation in Czechoslovakia. American units are now operating in areas promised to Stalin, without authorization from Supreme Headquarters, without coordination with Soviet command, and without any diplomatic clearance. Soviet forces are advancing toward the same territory from the east. Two Allied armies, millions of soldiers still armed and mobilized, now potentially converging on the same ground with no agreed protocol for contact. This is not a symbolic boundary dispute. This is an immediate command crisis with the potential to ignite a confrontation between allies before Germany has even surrendered. The occupation zones for post-war Germany and liberated territories had been negotiated at the highest political levels throughout late 1944 and early 1945.
Company, move out!
Yes, sir!
The Yalta Conference in February 1945 had established the fundamental framework. Germany would be divided into Soviet, American, British, and French occupation zones. The boundaries were drawn on maps with precision. Coordinates were specified down to specific geographic features, and military commanders were informed through official channels that these lines represented binding political agreements at the level of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. The demarcation lines were not suggestions or flexible guidelines subject to battlefield interpretation. They were formal commitments that reflected months of complex negotiations about the post-war balance of power in Europe. Soviet forces would occupy eastern Germany, eastern Austria, and certain liberated territories, including specific portions of Czechoslovakia.
Soldiers, the enemy is advancing. Hold this position at all costs.
Yes, sir!
Move out! Soldiers, your dedication and valor are the bedrock of our nation's defense. Press on with unyielding resolve.
American and British forces would halt at agreed boundaries and not advance into Soviet zones regardless of military opportunity or tactical advantage. These agreements had been made explicitly to prevent the kind of friction and misunderstanding that could destroy the alliance before victory was secured. For military commanders at all levels, the practical implications were clear and had been communicated through multiple channels. Operational planning had to account for political boundaries that might not align with tactical advantages or logical military objectives. An enemy-held city might be militarily accessible and strategically valuable, but remain politically off-limits if it fell within the designated Soviet zone of occupation. Territory that could be easily captured with minimal casualties might have to be deliberately left for Soviet forces to occupy, according to the agreed timeline and coordination procedures. Eisenhower had emphasized these restrictions repeatedly and forcefully in directives to subordinate commanders throughout March and April 1945. His written orders specified explicitly that forces were not to advance beyond designated demarcation lines without explicit authorization from Chief Headquarters. The boundaries were marked clearly on operational maps distributed to Army, Corps, and Division commands. Commanders at every level had been briefed personally on the political sensitivity of respecting these demarcations. The command structure understood, or was supposed to understand, that violating occupation zone agreements was not merely a tactical error or a breach of military protocol, but a strategic transgression with immediate diplomatic consequences that could extend to the highest levels of Allied governments. The specific area where Third Army would create the crisis was in western Czechoslovakia, with American forces approaching the industrial center of Pilsen and potentially advancing toward Prague itself. The agreed demarcation placed this entire region firmly in the Soviet occupation zone. American forces advancing rapidly from the west through collapsing German resistance were supposed to halt at specified coordinates and allow Soviet forces advancing from the east to occupy these areas according to the timeline and procedures that had been negotiated. The military logic for American forces continuing to advance was straightforward and appealing. German resistance was minimal to non-existent. Rapid progress was easily achievable. Significant territory, including major population centers, could be liberated quickly with very low casualties. The political logic for halting was equally clear, but less satisfying to field commanders. The territory had been formally promised to the Soviets through diplomatic agreements, and taking it would constitute a direct violation of commitments made at the highest levels of Allied cooperation. Third Army's advance during late April and the first days of May 1945 was characterized by operational speed that consistently exceeded planning assumptions and headquarters expectations. German resistance throughout the American sector was not merely weakening, but actively collapsing. Entire divisions were surrendering intact. Defensive lines that German commanders had ordered held were disintegrating before American forces even reached them. Patton's units were covering distances in single days that operational plans had allocated weeks to accomplish. The tempo of advance created a dynamic situation where forward units were reaching and sometimes exceeding their objectives before higher headquarters had fully processed the implications of their positions or issued updated guidance. Deutsche Corps, commanded by Major General Stafford Leroy Irwin, was advancing through Bavaria toward the Czechoslovak border with multiple divisions moving on parallel axes. By early May, lead elements of the Corps were approaching Pilsen, a major industrial and population center. German forces in the area were retreating in disorder or surrendering with minimal resistance. The operational situation as assessed by forward commanders suggested clearly that American forces could advance rapidly and deeply into Czechoslovakia, liberating substantial territory and multiple population centers with limited casualties and minimal expenditure of resources. Patton saw the opportunity with characteristic clarity and understood the military logic for continuing the advance without hesitation or delay. His operational instinct, honed through years of mobile warfare and reinforced by continuous success, was to exploit battlefield success and maintain momentum regardless of administrative or procedural complications. German forces were thoroughly beaten and incapable of organized resistance. American units were advancing successfully with high morale and adequate supplies. The Czechoslovak population was demonstrably welcoming liberation by Western forces. From a purely military and humanitarian perspective, halting the advance to respect a political boundary negotiated in conference rooms far from the battlefield made little tactical sense when the enemy was in full retreat, and friendly territory could be taken easily and held securely. The forward elements of Deutsche Corps crossed the agreed demarcation line into Czechoslovakia and advanced toward Pilsen without pausing to request or wait for authorization from higher headquarters. This movement was not necessarily a deliberate and conscious violation of orders in the sense of willful disobedience by officers who understood they were breaking rules. It was aggressive initiative and forward momentum operating faster than the command approval process could function. Combat units were moving, encountering minimal or non-existent resistance, and continuing to advance because that was precisely what mobile warfare doctrine prescribed and what their training and experience had conditioned them to do. The political constraints on that advance were being communicated through command channels and staff procedures that simply couldn't keep pace with the physical rate of movement on the ground. By the time Staff headquarters received clear and confirmed intelligence that Third Army units had crossed substantially beyond the demarcation line, American forces were already operating significantly inside the Soviet occupation zone. They were in areas they had not been authorized to enter, approaching cities they were not supposed to liberate, and creating accomplished facts on the ground that directly contradicted the political agreements about post-war occupation zones. The reports reaching Eisenhower's headquarters indicated clearly that Patton was not merely approaching the boundary with advanced reconnaissance elements, but had crossed it in force and was continuing to advance deeper into Soviet-designated territory. His forces were moving toward Prague itself, the Czechoslovak capital, which lay deep inside the agreed Soviet zone. Eisenhower's staff understood immediately, and with complete clarity, that this was not a minor boundary confusion or a temporary reconnaissance probe, but a significant violation of occupation agreements with potentially serious and immediate diplomatic consequences. Eisenhower's position as Supreme Allied Commander of Allied Expeditionary Forces required him to constantly balance immediate military operations with broader political constraints that often conflicted directly with tactical opportunities and operational advantages. He commanded American, British, Canadian, and other Allied national forces, but his authority and his freedom of action were constrained at every level by political agreements made at governmental levels above military command structures. The occupation zone demarcations were not military decisions that Eisenhower had made based on operational considerations. They were formal political commitments from Roosevelt and Churchill to Stalin that Eisenhower was required to enforce regardless of his personal views or the military situation on the ground. When intelligence staff presented Eisenhower with confirmed reports that Third Army had crossed into the Soviet occupation zone in strength, he faced an immediate decision point with no good options. He could allow the advance to continue, accepting whatever diplomatic consequences and potential Soviet reaction might follow. He could order an immediate halt, which might leave American forces in awkward and potentially exposed tactical positions if they subsequently had to withdraw from territory already occupied. He could attempt to negotiate directly with Soviet military command to legitimize retroactively the presence of American forces in areas they were not supposed to be occupying according to formal agreements. The complexity of the situation was compounded significantly by timing and the broader operational context. Germany had not yet formally surrendered. Combat operations were still ongoing in some sectors. Soviet forces were also advancing rapidly from the east and would soon reach the same areas that Third Army was entering from the west. The potential for direct and uncoordinated contact between American and Soviet forces under unclear circumstances was not theoretical, but immediate and dangerous. Both armies were still in full combat mode, still expecting enemy resistance at any moment, still operating with aggressive tactical doctrines that emphasized rapid action and overwhelming force. Eisenhower's headquarters had been maintaining communication with Soviet command throughout the final weeks of the war in Europe, specifically to coordinate operations and prevent accidental confrontations between Allied forces converging from opposite directions. These communications were functional but characterized by significant friction and mutual suspicion. Soviet commanders were deeply suspicious of American and British intentions and motivations. American commanders were increasingly frustrated with Soviet unwillingness to coordinate operations more closely or share intelligence more freely. The relationship remained nominally cooperative, but was clearly strained, maintained primarily because both sides desperately needed to focus all available resources and attention on defeating Germany rather than on managing Allied tensions. The intelligence report about Third Army's position forced Eisenhower to consider seriously what Soviet reaction might be to American forces operating inside their designated occupation zone. Would Soviet commanders interpret American presence as territorial aggression or political bad faith? Would they demand immediate and complete withdrawal? Would they accelerate their own forces' movement to secure territory they believed had been formally promised to them? The potential for miscalculation, misunderstanding, and unintended confrontation was substantial and immediate. Eisenhower also had to consider carefully the political dimension at the highest governmental levels. Roosevelt had died suddenly in April. Truman was now president and was still in the process of developing his approach to Soviet relations and post-war European questions. Churchill was increasingly vocal in his concerns about Soviet intentions and actions in Eastern Europe. The broader political context for Allied-Soviet relations was shifting in ways that were not yet fully clear, but the military command structure still operated under agreements and assumptions made before these shifts had occurred or become visible. The fundamental issue confronting Eisenhower was command authority and military discipline. Patton was a subordinate commander who was supposed to operate within boundaries and constraints set by higher headquarters based on both military and political considerations. Those boundaries included tactical objectives, operational limitations, and political constraints that were equally binding. Crossing into the Soviet occupation zone without explicit authorization was a clear violation of command discipline, regardless of any military justification that might be offered. Eisenhower had to enforce that discipline even if doing so meant deliberately forgoing military advantages and accepting criticism for limiting American success. Eisenhower's response to the intelligence reports about Third Army's unauthorized advance into the Soviet occupation zone was immediate, unambiguous, and forcefully expressed. According to detailed staff accounts preserved in headquarters records and Eisenhower's own later documentation and memoirs, he ordered Patton directly and explicitly to halt all forward movement of forces at the agreed demarcation line and to withdraw immediately any units that had crossed into territory designated for Soviet occupation. The order was not phrased as a suggestion, a recommendation, or guidance for Patton's consideration. It was a direct command that left absolutely no room for interpretation, independent judgment, or continued forward action. The formal communication to Third Army headquarters, transmitted through military channels and preserved in official records, emphasized in the strongest possible terms that the occupation zone boundaries were not subject to negotiation, modification, or interpretation by field commanders. Regardless of military opportunity, tactical advantage, or operational momentum, American forces would respect completely and without exception the political agreements that had been made at the highest levels of Allied governmental command. Patton was instructed explicitly to cease all forward movement toward Prague and to establish defensive positions that complied fully with the agreed demarcation coordinates. Eisenhower's staff documentation from this critical period shows his reasoning with complete clarity. He recognized fully that continuing the advance would create an immediate and serious crisis with Soviet military command that could fundamentally undermine the alliance at exactly the moment when Allied cooperation was most essential for managing Germany's surrender and occupation. Germany was on the verge of formal surrender. The occupation of Germany and administration of liberated territories would require extensive Allied coordination and cooperation. Creating confrontation and bad faith over Czechoslovakia would poison that essential coordination and potentially create direct military incidents between Allied forces that could escalate rapidly beyond anyone's ability to control. In direct communications with his senior staff officers, preserved in contemporary records and later accounts, Eisenhower made absolutely clear that he understood and even appreciated Patton's military logic and operational instincts, but rejected them as inadequate justification for violating binding political agreements. The military advantages of reaching Prague before Soviet forces were real and substantial, but remained fundamentally secondary to the overriding strategic necessity of maintaining Allied unity and avoiding confrontation. Eisenhower's role as Supreme Commander required him to subordinate tactical opportunities and operational advantages to broader strategic imperatives, and in this specific case, the strategic imperative was unquestionably respecting the occupation zone agreements that had been negotiated at the highest political levels. Patton's response to these direct orders, documented extensively in his personal diary entries and in communications with his own staff, showed profound frustration and fundamental disagreement with the decision. He believed strongly that American forces should liberate as much European territory as possible, while they retained the military capability and momentum to do so. He argued forcefully that political considerations negotiated by diplomats should not be allowed to override military success achieved by soldiers in combat. His firmly held view was that Third Army had reached these advanced positions through legitimate combat operations against German forces and should not be required to withdraw or halt simply to accommodate political agreements made without proper regard to battlefield realities or military considerations. Eisenhower's counter-argument, expressed clearly through staff channels and formal command directives, was that political agreements were not subordinate to battlefield realities, but were in fact superior to them in the hierarchy of considerations. Military operations existed to serve political objectives set by legitimate governments. Field commanders did not possess authority to override or ignore political decisions made at the level of heads of government and formalized through diplomatic agreements. The occupation zones had been agreed upon formally by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin through extensive negotiations. Military commanders at all levels would implement those agreements faithfully, regardless of their personal views about the wisdom or military logic of the arrangements. The orders to Third Army were enforced without modification or compromise. American forces halted their advance toward Prague and established static defensive positions at the agreed demarcation line. Units that had crossed substantially into the Soviet occupation zone conducted organized withdrawals back to positions that complied with the formal agreements. The advance that Patton had believed would liberate Czechoslovakia and demonstrate American military capability was terminated by direct command directive from the highest level of Allied military authority. Soviet forces subsequently occupied Prague and all the territories that had been formally designated for their occupation zone without American interference or presence. The incident of Third Army crossing unauthorized into the Soviet occupation zone illuminated with perfect clarity the fundamental and unavoidable tension between military effectiveness and political control that characterizes all coalition warfare. Patton's advance was militarily successful by every measurable standard. His forces were winning every engagement, liberating substantial territory, and encountering minimal resistance that posed no serious threat to continued operations. From a purely operational and tactical perspective, continuing the advance made complete military sense and appeared fully justified. The enemy was thoroughly beaten and incapable of organized resistance. The local population welcomed liberation enthusiastically. Military objectives could be achieved easily with minimal casualties and resource expenditure. But warfare, particularly coalition warfare involving multiple sovereign nations with different interests, is never purely operational or divorced from political context. Military operations serve political purposes defined by governments and operate necessarily within political constraints established through diplomatic agreements. The occupation zone arrangements represented political decisions about the post-war order in Europe and the balance of power between allied nations. Those decisions had been made at the highest levels of government, based on considerations that extended far beyond immediate military advantage or tactical opportunity. Violating those carefully negotiated agreements would produce diplomatic and political consequences that no amount of military success could compensate for or ameliorate. The danger inherent in the situation was not theoretical or distant, but immediate and potentially catastrophic. Soviet and American forces were both operating in the same general geographic area, with millions of soldiers still fully armed, mobilized for combat, and organized in operational formations. The potential for unintended incidents, miscommunications based on language and cultural barriers, and escalating confrontations was substantial and real. Both armies were trained extensively for aggressive offensive action. Both had sustained heavy casualties over years of brutal warfare and maintained the combat mindset and operational tempo that sustained casualties produce. Contact between forces under unclear circumstances and without established protocols could easily produce violence that neither side intended or desired, but that both might feel compelled to respond to forcefully, creating escalation spirals that could quickly move beyond anyone's control. Eisenhower's decision to enforce the demarcation line strictly and immediately was not fundamentally about limiting American military success or denying Patton credit for his achievements. It was about preventing a potentially catastrophic breakdown in Allied relations at precisely the moment when that alliance was most urgently needed for immediate practical purposes. Germany was about to surrender formally, but managing that surrender and establishing occupation authority required extensive cooperation between Allied powers. The emerging tensions that would later characterize the Cold War were already visible to perceptive observers, but open confrontation and acknowledged hostility had not yet occurred. Eisenhower was deliberately trying to preserve enough cooperation and trust to complete the immediate essential task of ending the active war and establishing stable occupation arrangements. The incident also demonstrated clearly the inherent limits of battlefield initiative and tactical opportunism in warfare that serves strategic political purposes. Patton's operational instincts and aggressive leadership were absolutely sound from a tactical and operational perspective. Aggressive exploitation of battlefield success was precisely what mobile warfare doctrine prescribed and what military theory recommended. But operational doctrine and tactical theory operate necessarily within a strategic framework established by political authority. Commanders who ignore or attempt to override strategic constraints in favor of tactical opportunities create problems and consequences that tactical success alone cannot solve or compensate for. What Eisenhower said when Patton's army crossed into the Soviet occupation zone was, in its essential meaning, that command authority established through political agreements took absolute precedence over battlefield opportunity and tactical advantage. He ordered immediate and complete compliance with the demarcation line, not because military advantage was unimportant or irrelevant, but because political stability and alliance cohesion mattered more in the specific circumstances. The decision reflected Eisenhower's sophisticated understanding that his role as Supreme Allied Commander required managing not merely military operations and tactical successes, but also the complex political relationships and diplomatic agreements that made large-scale coalition operations possible. Patton's instincts to advance aggressively and liberate territory were militarily sound and tactically correct, but strategically dangerous in ways that Patton either didn't fully appreciate or chose to disregard. And Eisenhower chose strategic stability and political reliability over tactical advantage and operational momentum.